afternoon again. Welcome to the School of Architecture, UIC. On behalf of Dean Peter Kirchner and myself, welcome to the school and the College of Architecture and the Arts. Today we're happy to restage the second part of our four-part event sponsored by the Cervantes Institute. The four-day event is generally called New Ways of Inhabiting the City. Last night we kicked it off with a lecture by Stan Allen. Tomorrow will be Javier Vendrell lecture at 1 p.m. called Before Landscape Urbanism. And on Friday, the fourth and last event, 1 o'clock, will be Jose Antonio Acevedo with a lecture titled Urban Turn. Before giving you the lowdown of today's events, I'm just going to turn it over to Javier to say a few words about the Cervantes Institute, and then I'll go through everyone on the panel.
Well, to understand a little bit why the Cervantes Institute is supporting this event, we'll talk a little bit about what the Cervantes Institute is. It's a public institution founded by the Spanish government in 1991 to promote the Spanish language, teaching and knowledge of the culture of Spain, of the Spanish-speaking countries. It's now the largest institution of the Spanish teaching organization with more than 60 centers around the world. Instituto Cervantes offers an extensive curriculum and a program of diverse cultural activities, the majority of which are free of charge and open to the public. These events include film, concert, festival, lectures, arts exhibitions, and other exhibitions. The extensive library of the Cervantes Institute is open to all the public in order to support the study of the Spanish language and the culture of Spain and of the Latin American countries. Outside the room, there is information about the Cervantes Institute. If you are interested in what they do, there is one of these travel brochures and send it, and you will do the information. There is a webpage that you can look, which is chicago.cervantes.es. And also, I would like to thank the main sponsor of this long weekend, which is the Fundación Caja de Navarra. If some of you thought that these signs that are around here, that is leftovers of the Yes We Can campaign of Obama, you are wrong. Not that we don't support the Obama campaign, but that's the logo of the Fundación Caja de Navarra. What says there in Spanish says that's a project chosen by the clients. So, the Fundación Caja de Navarra tries to make banking more human, banking which consists both financial and social results, which considers both financial and social results, which measure both tangible and intangible results. When the customers choose a social project, they know how much money they contribute to and how this money becomes drinking water for a village in Africa, a grand research for cancer, or cultural event like this one.
Thank you. I'm just going to go around quickly and introduce the panel, although most of them should be familiar to you. And then I'll describe the structure, and we'll move along because Dana and Stan have to run off very quickly after the event. So at the break, if you want autographs from either of them, you'll have to get them right away because you won't see them at the end. We're going to start this afternoon with Claire Lister, who's an assistant professor here at UIC, as you know. Claire was the co-guest editor of the 306090 issue entitled Regarding Public Space, and has had her research on FedEx published in the book, The Landscape Urbanism Reader, that Stan showed in the lecture last night. Alex Lerner, next to Claire, will be joining the faculty in January as an assistant professor. He received, or is about to receive, his PhD from the ETH in Zurich, where he's been teaching and researching with Kaiserot. His book, Grand Urban Rules, is forthcoming from 010 Publishers. Dana Cuff, professor in the Department of Architecture and Urban Design at UCLA, where she's also the founding director of City Lab. Her book, Provisional Cities, came out from MIT Press. Sam Jacob is founding director of the London-based office FAT, Fashion Architecture Taste, in charge of the recently completed Hoogvliet project in the Netherlands. Is that correct? Very good. It's very good, isn't it? And also the editor and author of the blog Strange Harvest, which you should check out. Starting out the other end, Juan Ruiz is an awesome assistant professor here at UIC, a registered architect in Argentina, where he recently won second prize in the international competition for the Metropolitan Park of the Rosario Victoria Bridge. Sarah Dunn is an assistant professor also at UIC and co-founder of the firm Urban Lab, not to be confused with Dana's City Lab. Sarah's firm won the City of the Future competition sponsored by the History Channel with the project Growing Water, and Sarah's also research director at ArchiWorks. Javier Vendrell, known to all of you here and abroad, is professor at the school where he's the director of the Barcelona Traveling Studio. He began his firm in Barcelona with several significant public projects for the 1992 Barcelona Olympics, and now has an office based jointly in Chicago and Barcelona with award-winning residences and landscape projects. Stan Allen, as you know from last night, is Dean of the Princeton School of Architecture and Principal of Stan Allen Architect. He's the author of Points and Lines, Diagrams and Projects for the City, and Practice, which is being republished by Routledge this month. Penelope Dean, also assistant professor here in the school, a registered architect in the Netherlands, completing also her PhD dissertation next week at UCLA entitled Delivery Without Discipline, and Penelope was the editor of Punch 8 through 11. So that's the cast of characters. The structure is, we're going to go through, hopefully, two parts of a panel. One that is supposed to end at 5, and then have about a 15-minute break and come back. But the idea is that Claire, Alex, Dana, and Sam will present 12 minutes each on a kind of provocation. And then we'll have a collective discussion together and with all of you. So it's really seemed to be more of a working session. And then we'll have a break, and then we'll have the other four, Juan, Sarah, Javier, and Stan present 12 minutes, and Penelope will moderate that discussion that we'll also have collectively. Again, the idea is really a working session. It's not unlike what Dana and Roger Sherman and I organized. What? You're such an international tribe here. A conference that Dana and Roger Sherman and I organized a year and a half ago at UCLA on trying to rethink the city. So we're trying to hijack this event. Stan was also at that event at UCLA as a continuation of that discussion with some new principles, because we're also working on that publication. And part of the discussion there was how do we think of, how can we start to loosely form ourselves as a new group of thinking about urbanism, contemporary urbanism in the U.S. specifically, and providing an alternative to two dominant strands of urbanism in the U.S., namely the new urbanism as a sort of top-down model of rules, and everyday urbanism, you could say, a bottom-up system. So either too much design prescription or zero design prescription. Loosely, the two panels today are organized as establishments and economies is the first group, and ecologies and environments is the second panel. I don't expect those categories to hold, but I think that they both invoke the two eco words that Stan talked about yesterday, which was ecology and economy, and how we can start to conflate or rearrange those discussions. But I would say the idea of establishments and economies is really the city as a network of exchanges, and also exchanges between specific individuals. In other words, what is the subject of the contemporary city? Who, as individuals and also as collectives or audiences, or taste cultures. The subject of the city in the sense of how does one have agency in the city or develop an attitude or set of techniques that can allow you to intervene in the city, but also in the sense of how do we think about constructing more public or collective constituencies or audiences. The second panel on the urban environments or ecologies, again, takes up some of the themes of landscape before and after urbanism that we've been discussing yesterday and will tomorrow, but also how we interact with the natural and artificial systems, how ecological and landscape models have infiltrated architecture and design, and how we operate back in those contexts and set up the boundaries or relationships between our interventions and the quote-unquote natural world. I think that the way, am I supposed to be just...
You're doing real good.
Yeah, just let me know. But another thing. I think that, the questions, I guess, that I would have of all of us, and again, this is a kind of work in progress about do we form some form of generational, transgenerational set of ideas that could, if not make a movement, well, why the hell not? Why not make a movement as an alternative to these other ones? See what we share, and I guess the questions I would have is I would assume that implicitly or explicitly each of the 12-minute provocations would address A, what exactly is the contemporary city today? In other words, what's its characteristic trait? Almost like the diagnosis. I mean, everyone implicitly will have a specific issue or diagnostic or approach to the contemporary city. But one would hope, have a set of desires or promises or projections about what it should be. So it's not only what it is, but also what one wants to make it, or accelerate it, or transform it, or divert it into. And thirdly, what would be the means or the techniques through which one would engage that movement from where we are to where we want to go? Like, doubly, that would be my set of responses before we've even seen anything. But now we can start. So, thank you. I will be the draconian timekeeper also.
So I'll go straight into the next call, shall we? To speak. I just following on from Bob's very quick kind of intro. I guess I focus this on looking at the new ways that we can kind of articulate what the post-war city is about, and what are the spaces or organisms that are enabled or disabled by these new ways. And I suppose for me, it's I'm interested in the notion of globalization as a new way, and how is that a driver of the city? And if it is a driver of the city, then what are the urban concepts that emerge to explain it? And what are the kind of the urbanisms, the spaces and the types and the collectives that are equally enabled by understanding that relationship? And so I'm very quickly going to just talk about some research. My thought is that there's a lot of people writing about globalization and sociology, globalization and economics, globalization and politics, but how do we start to talk about globalization and space at a very kind of basic level? And so I began to look at what I call evidence of where this is happening outside of architecture. And so this is some research. This is a map from last year on FedEx, which I have now determined is one of the kind of quintessential landscapes that might teach us how globalization impacts the built environment. And so these are a set of drawings or mappings that were made, geography, site, network, time, looking at how the kind of operations of the superhousing edifice are condensed into these like hyper-dense time periods over a 24-hour day. And then looking at trajectory, the kind of actual network, the movement of goods and cargo between different locations. And so formatted for an exhibition as a set of trays, that's the kind of piece in the exhibition, but more important than kind of the research is which I'm now working on, is how do you extract concepts from the research that might again start to describe these concepts in the city. And so I'm looking at sort of for what we would consider four traditional attributes of space making, thinking about size, form, scale, and type, and looking at FedEx to kind of come up with new descriptions or new explanations for these architectural terms. The issue with sight is the notion of convergence or emptiness, which is also expressed as input or output. The notion of form, that maybe smart round dome skin is an expression that maybe landscape and horizontality is becoming kind of even smarter than superstructure. The notion that architecture can be now measured as landscape, meaning big buildings that are measured in acres, not square feet, which came out of analysis of the superhelpful office. And the notion of type, which is the kind of ambiguous one at the moment, but that not only looking at the new types of spaces of the 21st century, a cargo airport for one, but also new collectives that come out of these. And so then that kind of gets distilled into kind of a notion about sites, looking at sites that are infrastructural or whether they're used, and the strategies that are coming out of these previous concepts that also I've helped kind of describe some projects, design projects I've done, is the notion of supersize, dissolve, multiply, or two-surface. And so I'm going to show two projects really, really quickly, and one is the supersize project and one is the dissolve project. And if I run out of time after the supersize one, we'll talk about the dissolve one another day. So again, taking this notion of convergence as a really, it's interesting to talk about convergence in the post-war city when we have read so much about the dispersal of urbanism, but there's a relationship between how things disperse and how things flow and when they need to come together. And when they come together in kind of super active moments. So there's flow, but then every now and then there's a kind of hyperactive moment that exchanges the flow or controls the flow. So this project, some of you may have seen just kind of over the weekend, looks at the implications of high-speed rail. This is the national map of what high-speed rail could look like. And the circled area is the kind of Midwest regional map that then these are the kind of cities that would have terminals within this kind of transportation system. This was part of an exhibition with the CAC. A group of people we were divided up, we each got a site, and I chose O'Hare because part of the plan would be to have a high-speed train stop at O'Hare. And so what became interesting to me was that here you're looking at a site that already has a convergence of infrastructure, and now you're amplifying that convergence. And the fact that O'Hare is probably one of the most global sites in the whole country, it had a lot of resonance for kind of thinking about a new type of urbanity. For those of you who do not know, O'Hare is now going under a huge three-phase expansion proposal that basically is resulting in the airport going from this runway configuration to a parallel runway configuration. And in the process, the addition potentially of new terminals. They say that this will cost the city $18 billion, which will make it the largest public works project after the Channel Tunnel with respect to money and the sort of time that it was built in. So the yellow is existing and pink is proposed over a series of the next 50 years. Part of that then is kind of my interest in perhaps how you would start to develop the airport as a new center of the city. And so at the kind of macro scale, Chicago could become a dual-centric city where the loop, the existing kind of economic center, and then this new space called Strip at O'Hare, and they are both connected nationally by the train, which is the red line. And then you start to think, okay, if you're going to kind of develop a kind of new urbanity around the airport, you have to start to think of the formal configuration of the airport with respect to the city. And so the image on the left is O'Hare, but it's also, could be any city, is the notion that the airport sits as an island in its urban context. And then the first thing that one would have to do is kind of formally integrate the airport landscape into the city landscape. So that's the kind of formal challenge of the project. The second one is understanding the kind of acoustic and safety zoning systems at an airport. This is the existing acoustic diagram of the present day configuration of O'Hare, going from loudest 75 to 65 DNLs, which according to the FAA and the government is the kind of legal acoustic boundary for housing and many kind of normative programs. This is the new acoustic diagram of the OMP plan. You can see the lighter green is the existing 65 DNL line. The darker green is the new 65 DNL line that will occur as a result of the expansion. The dark blue are existing terminals. The kind of lighter cyan is projected terminals. So the first idea is, how do you start to think about zoning at an airport, and how could you develop a zoning model that was based on acoustics? And so you have, following on from the new parallel runway configuration 1 starts to kind of get these strips of loud and quiet space. And then, interestingly enough, this word, the terminal, which becomes the strip of the project that you saw on the earlier map, is generated by the fact that all the terminals are going to kind of neatly line up in this kind of central strip at O'Hare. And so that starts to kind of talk about a potential territory that could provide exchange between not only the terminals, but act as a kind of nexus of activity on the site that then would be supported by the kind of other program strips. This is a kind of finer grain programming of those strips. The FAA does issue programming charts based on DNL levels that are used by firms that do master plans for airports. So these are all legitimate programs that could take place. And so, of interest is that you end up getting housing in these kind of pockets of spaces that fall within the 65 DNL line. And literally, you could be living at the airport. This is an infrastructural diagram that starts to show the high-speed line, the metro lines, and an extension of the CTA line, which most of you know currently stops at Terminal 3. And so therefore, you begin to see the kind of convergence of train intersections on the east side. The city do, as part of the OMP, the third phase will provide a western entry to the Terminal 7, which somehow got missing off this diagram. And so this might be a kind of a graphic description of what the new land use at the airport could be, with sort of park space, housing, agricultural space that doesn't attract birds. There's a certain list of agricultural uses that one could provide that falls within the safety of the airlines. This is the terminal strip, more housing, warehousing, just kind of open space, and then more logistical warehousing facilities on the south end near the kind of exchange rail yard on the south end. This is existing. And then, so that's the kind of site plan, and then very quickly the actual terminal strip itself. This is the terminal current and proposed terminal configuration. This is the size of this strip with respect to Central Park. And this is what I mean about this kind of measuring space in acres, because somehow 16,900 feet doesn't seem to have resonance, but when we say it's 1,500 acres, the scale of that space then immediately jumps out of an architectural realm and into a kind of agricultural or landscape realm. And so you're calibrating space with kind of a different scale. And so then the idea was, if we're starting to program this strip, how do you put stuff in that strip that is not in conflict with the safety that's required or with the acoustic diagram. And so you end up wanting to build underground, but you can't kind of build an underground building twice the size of Central Park unless you start to look at super big buildings that already exist in the world. And this is a chart of the 10 biggest buildings in the whole world. And it couldn't even fit all of those into the strip. So at some point in the design, the building started to, wasn't big enough in terms of how we think big about space. And might not be able some of these, I'm not going to go through that in the instance of time. But the biggest, I don't know, the biggest building is it's not one of those casino hotels in Macau in China. It's like 10.5 million square feet. And so very quickly then this strip starts to get developed in these clusters, terminal clusters. This is the west side, Terminal 7. This is the existing Terminal 3. And then this is Terminal 5 International, which will get in addition to Terminal 6. The blue is the CTA line that stops at each of the terminals. And then the colored kind of ovals are kind of programs that come out of this chart. And the notion is that then all the parking for O'Hare, and I didn't count it, and I forget what it was, would fit in the kind of gray residual space. The highway would come from the east side into the underground out to the west side, and then you have Metra on the west side, Metra and high-speed rail on the east side. And so this is what it starts to look at, the kind of compressed zoning diagram. West Terminal gets kind of convention, casino, office. The mid-zone, because Terminal 3 is still the most used terminal at the airport, got more kind of entertainment zoning. And then the east side, because it was close to the train and more the kind of transportation interchange, got some educational program and market. That Alshmere market could be located here. And then that's a sort of 3D drawing that starts to kind of talk about the kind of clustering vis-a-vis the existing terminal layout. And then that's another view showing the kind of infrastructure and showing how the different terminals get sort of programmed. And then, of course, going back to the notion that, how do you put a huge building underground? Well, then the building starts to the program starts to kind of explode out of the kind of grade level in places where it's both safe to have higher building form and also in places that are not in kind of direct line of aircraft trajectories. And so that starts to kind of alleviate the spatial issues. How am I doing? Should I stop? Because I know we're kind of time.
15.
I can go on and I can stop.
Could you show more pictures and we can this time in our mind?
Pictures? Okay, well that's the end of that project. So that's why I was kind of...
Okay, great.
Okay, I'm not going to show this, but I'd only say that the O'Hare site is interesting because it's a convergence. There's already a convergence at the site, so the project amplifies it. This other project, which I'm not going to show, which most of you know before, is the Longdale project, which is of interest because it's a convergence of void. It's a convergence of nothingness. And so how do we go from a kind of hyperdense convergence to the kind of opposite where you're, devising planning strategies where there's nothing and where nobody is putting anything and it's pretty gray. And so they're the kind of opposites of that. I can just, as we're changing over, go through these. This is far less formal, this is more organizational planning. Even bits of policy in this. That's it.
Before inviting you to this when I read the slogan for the first time, I was puzzled by two words. First was new, the second was inhabiting. So at least I found an answer to the word inhabiting. I didn't find any for the word new. So for me, inhabiting the city is basically, it's not living together, but basically living next to each other. So I entitled this little provocation, Politics of Adjacencies. And this neighborhood relationship is characterized by four things. It's good rules, bad rules, the rulers, and the rule. So I'm going to show you an example of each. So the first one is really the latest one I found. That's a photograph taken 800 years ago. It's the city of San Timignano, you probably know. But in the meantime, I took a photograph of the same perspective, and now it looks like this. So I asked myself, what happened in between? The thing is quite easy. I think 700 years ago, the height of these nobility towers was set to the maximum height of the city hall, which is prominently in the middle. So, and what happened was that all the nobility lost interest in building another tower, because what made the city grow was the competition between striving aristocrats to build higher than the neighbor. So, but by limiting the maximum height towards the town hall was just basically quitting all the fun of doing so. Because every half-wealthy aristocrat was able to build that height. So there are basically four heights. It's the town hall height, it's the engineering height, and this rule was established to under the still popular pretext of public health by limiting the danger of the loose stones of the brave builders falling on the citizens' heads. So there's the engineering height, the dangerous height, and the desired height. And basically all was cut off because of the stipulation. And then the plague did the rest, and Florence took over power. So maybe if that rule wasn't in place, maybe it was San Timignano, not Florence, which made the rates for this region's capital. So that was a bad one. Now the next one is, this is a quite personal one. While we were living in the States for the first time, we had a quite cozy house. And we had an equally cozy front yard. So did our neighbor. But actually he didn't like ours. And we got in a terrible fight because he was accusing us, not us personally, but our front yard, to poison his very good lawn. And one day, so we couldn't solve it. One day, the police cars stopped in front of our house, and I don't really know what he looked like, but he must have looked something like this. So, and whenever I talk about with my colleagues about power and control in urban space and in urbanism, I'm always reminded of this image, and many urbanists complain about powerlessness and so on, but at least I did experience a moment of real power in urban design, which was this. And so we very quickly went out to mow our lawn, and what also happened was that our neighbor, our former opponent, borrowed me his lawnmower, and we really became friends because we now had the same kind of hobby. So basically, I told you about good rules and bad rules. If you didn't get it, the last one was a good one. So good one, bad rules, and there is Jack Parker. Probably some of you might know him. He's a famous developer from New York, and he set out to do this building, which is known as the Parker Meridian in Midtown Manhattan. And it's not very spectacular, but the way it was produced is quite spectacular. Because actually, you see one building, but okay, let me do it another way around. It's more dramatic. It's a very narrow site, and there apply a lot of restrictions. And there's also this sky exposure plane, which is having more restrictions as you go higher. Jack Parker wasn't really able to develop a profitable building there, but he had a very smart architect, and he's very smart himself. So, but he wanted to do a mixed-use building, so that's also part of this living next to each other. So he wanted to do an apartment tower, which he did in the end, and a hotel tower. So in fact, it was under the zoning law in New York, it was a classical mixed-use development. But the problem with mixed-use developments at that time was that there are even more restrictions applied for mixed-use developments. So what he basically did is something very smart. He basically claimed that this is not two buildings, but it's one building. And no, the other way around, sorry. It's not one building, but it's two buildings. And he was really like saying, and that's really fantastic, that it could be that two buildings are standing on top of each other. And in front of, and before the law, that's really true. I mean, the fantastic thing is he got 2 building permits for this building on 2 different tax lots. I mean, that's really, and the building has 2 different owners and also 2 different entrances. So he was able to do a building which was 110 something meter high, but actually was able to say, okay, it's 2 buildings, and he got a building permit from 2 institutions. The one was the Department of Housing, and the other was the Department of Incentives and Commerce, the Board of Commerce and Incentives, I think. So he was really able to play tricks on the city, and I think this is a really good example of an updated version of this. Maybe I don't know. The downtown athletic clubs looks really kind of sad against this one. So what he really achieved was something very precious. He achieved by that going upward. He achieved to secure the private view of his clientele over the public. So that reminded me, and that goes also to this point of how you actually cope with public space in the city. It's predominantly for me a political realm and also a political field. So you probably know all the story about the tragedy of the Commons. Do you know? No. Okay, that's good. Then I'm going to tell it to you. It's an article written by the biologist Garrett Hardin in '69, and it's not a coincidence that it's written in '69, I think. And it's talking about a very paradoxical situation, that there is a commons and there are farmers, and the commons is doomed to be overexploited, because every farmer is basically putting one cow after the other on this commons, because it's a simple kind of calculation. Because one cow means the whole profit for the one farmer, but it also means that the negative component of overgrazing is shared by all other farmers. So if you're a smart farmer, you're going to put one cow after the other on this commons. And I think that's really something very, very typical also to our cities in different kind of concerns, not only in the upward one, but also in all different kinds of discussions about neighborhoods and neighboring entities. So for a couple of time we are now collecting tools and methods for the architect to recapture a long-lost position, namely the position of the mad politician. I think it's for me, it's basically how I would, or what I would also like to as a provocation in that regard, that urban design is mainly about the mediating between public and private interests, and what is even more important is to actually try to design freedoms for all people involved. And rules, I mean, I got very interested in this kind of methodology, and I'm also looking at the bureaucracy and administration of the city, because I think that's very inspirational, and they have exactly the same problem as many of us urban designers have. They are doomed to cope with a lot of different interests and have only limited interaction capacity. And those rules are actually able to adjust this control, and they are far from being just deterministic instruments. And I think rules work at places where the plan is just not able to work anymore. And what you are able to is, by working with rules as a designer and by quasi embrace the city institutions and conquer its bureaucracy, is that you're actually able to play the same kind of tricks on the city as the city plays on us. So this is a very telling example. We were commissioned to do a redensification on this area. It's the Wijnhaven area in Rotterdam, very close to the River Maas and downtown Rotterdam. And we never drew any kind of plan for this area because in the end, Rotterdam is still a Central European city, and the regular Central European city hates high-rise. So we wanted to do high-rises, but if we would draw high-rises, they would probably say, no, you can't do this. So what we did is we set some very basic rules by setting some performance criteria, like you have to be able to look at from your apartment, you have to have the view to the River Maas. You're not supposed to cast shadow on other buildings, and you have to have an address to a certain street. And we also have this kind of slenderness rule there, which is just an arbitrary stipulation from ourselves, as we didn't like slabs, but we wanted to have slender towers. So what happened was that the cities thought, okay, you can, by these rules, you can at a maximum produce low-rise towers, or not even towers, and at the maximum maybe 2 or 3. This is a set of rules we use, and by now we are already able to marvel at about 5 towers going up there, and there's already 6 to be built. So this is, you can call it a trick we played on the city, but I think by the special strategic use of these rules, because these rules were all by themselves as something nobody could really oppose. If you say you are not allowed to cast shadow on other apartments, the city of course says yes, more of these rules. So we set 5 of them, and they were all they were coming from people who were just having the best in mind. So that's one. I think many of our projects are not able to be drawn in plans. So we have a kind of representational problem because we are not seen. And so many of our projects are actually computer programs, and this is one example. This is the Kaiserslautern parceling software, where you can put in special needs and desires of the future clientele, which is indicated by those houses, and you have all that, and it's moving across, and you have a certain area, and now you can move it by hand, and in the end, the infrastructure is put in. I can also do it manually. This is just a movie of it because it's just 12 minutes. So, but by this computer program, you're able to respond to a couple of needs and desires of the future inhabitants according to proximities to their neighbors, whom they want to live next to, and so on. The interesting thing is about the order of things, that this is really truly a project where the infrastructure comes last. So you might refer to it as a bottom-up project, but as the most robust urban element comes last. But I think these categories are also like obsolete somehow. So what you could do is you could do endless sets of possible outcomes, and just because of the different kind of desires the actual users are having. So, and it's getting built. You see this kind of Kaiserslautern pattern over there. Now it's already finished, and I also have a an aerial photograph of the finished version, but it's became very ugly. So I mean this very aesthetic layout of the streets, but so we really achieved what we wanted to do in this urban design project. We tried to organize the bad taste of the others. So one last provocation maybe, which became also sort of halfway real. There's a project in Zurich, and this is taking on with also different kind of density rules. We have created a kind of envelope, and maybe a last thing is that we are not really able to do models, but we were forced to by the client because the city had to have some model in order to promote this building. So we were doomed to do a model which is just basically not showing the actual result, but the constraints of it. So what we really try to do is to do this kind of aviary for the future buildings, which also only consist of well-reasoned and do-gooders rules. So actually also nobody could have anything against it. So, but the actual problem was when a developer came to us and said, okay, how can I be sure to develop a building there if I don't know how tall I can go? Because in fact it was really like this. It could have so many different outcomes, and because of those rules which established some sort of relationship between adjacent plots. So if you bought one and your neighbor was just quicker and bought one already and built it up, you were at a certain point only able to build at a certain size, or were not able to be building as high as you desired or as you planned to. But maybe this kind of procedure or this kind of natural order in this phasing process of these urban areas is much more natural than saying, okay, or establishing some kind of artificial phasing strategy where you just say, okay, this comes first, this comes second, but you can also easily let it decide the market for itself. So what it's really like is kind of aviary. I'm done.
Alex has said many things that I completely agree with, and has said them better than I would. And a lot of the project similarities, actually what I'm showing, is a kind of taking off from some things that Claire talked about and reinforcing some of the things that Alex discussed. And I called it planning euthanasia because I like to give planning with depth. And I don't think we have a planning school here in the school, do you? We did? Oh, not in the college. So I'm not insulting Bob. Where's he? I would like to begin to kill planning with the depth of something like zoning and building codes, and in particular what I'd like to do is get rid of the R1. But to get there, I'm going to take you through a couple of situations that I found myself in where this death wish occurred to me. I was working on this particular school that you see at the bottom, the Community Garden School, which is designed by David Ganning, and I did some of the preliminary programming work for, which was a very interesting project located in a mini mall in Los Angeles. And the codes, the building codes in California that we had to work with were basically codes that started in something like 1939 after the earthquake and were revised in 1953 during the post-war building boom expansion. And so the idea of school was something like this one right next door, Esperanza, which has some 15 acres, 10 to 15 acres, was the normal size of the average city school. And this was the site we had to deal with. Now, granted, there were 3.5 times as many students in Esperanza. There was still 12 times as much site. So we overcame those building codes in the kind of trick way that Alex described, we played a lot of tricks in order to make that school that you saw happen. But it seemed to me that that pointed out a problem that might be more generic that I would begin to attack and think about. So this is a project I've been working on for the last year, and as you'll see, it's in progress and only beginning to get to the architectural stages. This is a little town called Pacoima, which is in the northeast valley of Los Angeles. It's primarily Hispanic. It's relatively poor. And what interested me about Pacoima is what you see in this Google Earth photograph. I'm highlighted here, something that you could call the backlots of Pacoima, which are filled with backyard houses. All of those are illegal. And what's also interesting about Pacoima is, in this particular area, is that the lots were old agricultural lots that are something like 50 feet to 75 feet wide and 300 to 350 feet deep. So if you can kind of see, there's a house in the front. This was a garage probably. This is the front house. Here was a garage. They've added a little rental unit to bring in a little more income. This is probably some kind of workspace, possibly. It could be also an apartment building that's got 2 or 3 units in it. This may be some kind of parking area. Then there's a place where like old used cars are stored. Then there can be an area where there's just a junkie, and then there can be an area where there's goats. I mean, it really goes back and back and back. So, taking the model that was already existing in Pacoima, which seemed like was working pretty well for people, I wondered whether there was an opportunity in this to create an architecture that would yield a kind of community plan and attack the zoning ordinance simultaneously. That they might put in some new backfill in the backlots. And what that might look like, without taking out any of the illegal houses that already existed, was something that people were using and needing, that you could begin to multiply these in ways that would overcome some of the development problems that were happening in those areas that were kind of borderline R1. So the R1 is already defunct in a way in this neighborhood. Everything but the front house is illegal, but nobody's enforcing it. So when a developer would come into this kind of neighborhood, they would want to put 30 units on a site. And that's what the neighbors have been fighting. But for 30 units, you get certain economies that you can't get when you build 4. So we were trying to see if you could put 30 together through various kinds of strategies of project delivery that would then permit the same economies of scale and potentially give something back to the public. So all of that actually works out fairly effectively in terms of cost and economy and politics. The neighbors like this, the communities like this kind of transformation, if there's going to be any, because it doesn't touch the housing they already have, and it goes slowly enough. You do 1 at a time, 2 at a time. You put a limit maybe on the block, and if they don't like it, they can stop it midstream. So there's a sense of local control. This very much plays on what Alex saying, but goes against a kind of master planning approach and undermines the idea that you could blanket an area with a single zone like the R1 that might apply to every site that happens to fall under that color coding area. So in the end, in Pacoima, this town of 100,000, you could get actually 4,500 new units of housing if you built every backlot with backfill. That would require a special kind of zoning permissions and building permissions, which we thought we would exploit with the city by setting up templates. And this is just the beginning of the architectural thinking here. We would develop templates that both respected the sort of community interests in design, and each of these is a kind of Trojan horse, as we were talking about yesterday. Community generated program for what kinds and sizes of housing is generated by community groups. Sustainability, which the city of Los Angeles is advocating, and therefore permits the higher density that we're seeking. And affordability, which is the third Trojan horse. So we have to play a lot of tricks to get this kind of change in something that's as sacred as that zone where only a single kind of form is supposed to exist, through city works. So those 3 Trojan horses yielded 3 or 4 different templates, which then end up with this kind of crazy sets of possibilities, which also demonstrates that we're not going to blanket the neighborhood with condos, but we are still controlling the architecture so that we don't get the Kaiserswerth problem. Is that right, Alex? Did I say it? Yeah, where you end up with ugly urbanism, even though it's good in other ways. So we wanted good and beautiful urbanism. And then when you start to deploy it, you get these little mini building sites. Each of these ends up being for sale. And that trick was put in place for another people with the political approval system where you had to be wealth building housing for the current residents. All of this, I've had, we've worked with lawyers and planners. It's a really incredibly complicated system that you have to think through in order to take zoning in a much more strategic and tactical manner. Oh, and then we thought it was possible that prefabrication would be another mechanism by which costs could be brought down, and also design control. So we're still exploring which ones of these mechanisms is going to give us the greatest leverage in terms of building templates that will be then installed within the city. So to get your zoning density bonus, you will have to use one of these templates. Sustainable, affordable, and well-designed. So you say, all right, here's the R1 in its mass multiplication in the post-war period. These are these incredible Willard Garnett photographs. So there's really no urbanism and no architecture here. It's just a zone, and that zone predicts what it is that gets replicated across the landscape. And what got replicated across the landscape then were these very small boxes in most of the first post-war R1 areas. Here you see a couple from Los Angeles, a couple from different parts of Levittown. Each of these houses is under 900 square feet. Maybe the second Levittown model was 1,000, but they're very small coverage, really low FARs, which leaves a lot of backlot for backfill. And I just want to remind you that there's plenty of room for architecture in backfill, because Japan has already demonstrated that this is maybe its version of that Garnett landscape. And what's possible there are these tiny sites, some of which sit on less than 250 square foot parcels. Now, if you want to end up with a kind of urbanism that isn't kind of muscular show, although I'm not opposed to this, the idea that this produces a kind of urbanism in terms of scale and fabric seems clear to me. Whether or not we can sit in between something like the zone and the one-off building is what's interesting to me. Can we create something like the rules that Alex is discussing without creating a plan? So here's the zone that I was working in. All that yellow is R1, or is nominally R1. As you saw, it's actually practically something like R4. But these are the kinds of principles then that this new kind of urban rule generating would operate on. A kind of architectural opportunism, meaning that it's not a blanket that you lay over things. It's a series of situations that you discover and take as opportunities. That it's highly site-specific, and that there are classes of sites within the city that you could look for, like backlots, or like alley houses, or like linear infrastructure that's too wide. There's plenty of types of sites that operate as a different scale of rule-making opportunities. But this then leads to a collective incrementalism, and I was talking to David Brown about this earlier, how you take an incremental or single site strategy and make it add up to more. That's one of the intentions of this project. That it builds economies into what I would say are local politics, but it builds the economy, it builds notions of economy into the political realm. It's tactical, it helps produce the R1's euthanasia,
issue that came up yesterday in the questions to Sam, actually. Questions about abstraction and representation in relation to urbanism and landscape. And we'll also talk a little bit about Alex, the bad taste that he feels. And I want to talk about stories rather than rules and narratives rather than codes. So it's the dominant form of urbanism is the diagram device, which generates form. Somehow there's sort of logic that works through from something which appears to be objective, factual, to some kind of formal resolution. But fact, we used to have this phrase, taste on space, as a way of prioritising the surface, and the surface being a place where issues like class and value are actually visible. So, ironically, the most ephemeral and decorative bits of buildings might well be the most political bits. So, in a sense, we talk about the same thing in relation to the diagram. We're going to begin with a short foray into non-architectural bits. We're already there, already. I don't know what to say. It's the intro. Right. It's a short history of the development of soccer pitches. So this is long before TV deals and Middle Eastern owners and tabloids, gamblers and so on. So long before soccer was actually codified as a sport. It used to look like this. This is kind of folk football, which is played village against village. And it would be on a team, sometimes it would be like married men against the bachelor. Round. Unlimited players, no rules really, apart from how to get people out into the church doorway or whatever it was. And in this moment, the whole landscape between two bridges becomes transformed into a space. So all the houses of agriculture and sites of worship and everything like that loses its everyday meaning. And it becomes kind of abstract. It's just like, does it really attempt to score a goal? And then become understood by a different set of rules. So I'd argue it's this landscape, this scene, which is codified into a standardised marking out of a modern soccer pitch. Like that. And somewhere in those lines is a kind of latent or remnant of landscape. And these pictures have incredible beauty. It's kind of real kind of abstraction. It looks like it's a real topographic design to create. Obviously, just evolved in a sort of vernacular way. And there's something about soccer which I think it is a kind of essentialised element. So it's a kind of total spatial scenario, which is very different to other kinds of sports. So here's a series of drawings which imagine the landscape's creeping back into the soccer pitch. So here the centre circle becomes the lake. Forest. A bit of geography. The penalty area becomes part of the church. There's a church. Well. So, in this sort of process of abstraction, process of essentialization, there's a sort of a process of boiling down square miles of landscape into this set of very few lines. But you can untangle it and unravel kind of complex landscape from this abstraction. And maybe this process of unraveling and speculating on the history of a football pitch is also understanding the spatial place that they might relate to the present in the landscapes that surround us. So as much as it needs understanding, there might be a process by which one might direct a form of urban analysis, as well as looking to manufacture design approaches. And it's kind of that way of thinking to project here, which I showed you when I was here in February, but it's now finished, so you can see the final project. See it before. You need to have some background to this project. The pink bits the site is a town called Hoogvliet. People might not pronounce it correctly, it's impossible. And it's the satellite suburb of Rotterdam. All that light grey stuff is the harbour. So it's a real suburb. It's very disconnected from metropolitan Rotterdam. And it's a post-war new town. Essentially, it's a service, a harbour, and a oil refinery. Unlike most post-war new towns, it's totally fucked up. It was designed for 60,000 people with all kinds of facilities, which after about 10 years into construction, the authorities got a bit bored of it and decided to locate the rest of this population somewhere else and all the activities there. So it becomes abandoned. And then this abandoned city becomes filled with more traditional suburban stuff. Here's a plan. The bottom bit is the town, and the top bit is the oil refinery. We don't look like a bit of town. And this is what it looks like. There's the refinery, the town. You can see bits of proper post-war new town, and you can see a bit of suburban infill on the right. You can also see the bit which are left over between industry and town. But there's lots and lots of green stuff. Right. So over time, essentially, the whole situation changes and it becomes a very different place from what you've planned. And we were asked by an organisation called WIMBY, which stands for Welcome Inside Africa, to first of all just make a response to the mission. Now, WIMBY is a sort of think tank that was working with the planners to direct policy, to direct approaches to new developments in town. We began to look at essentially the conflict between what was built and what actually happened in terms of occupation. So looking at things like this little carriage that jacked into the municipal power as a moment of expression of an imaginary place. One of the coexistence between built fabric and town. So we're looking at a series of conflicts between what was supposed to be what happened, industrial versus natural, generic in the sense of technocratic planning versus the very specific in the way that it's developed its own specific character. We're looking at things like this, front gardens, incredibly banal, on one hand, incredibly rich landscapes on the other hand, which are full of narrative, which overlays existing conditions.
Excuse me, can you speak a little more into the mic? We can't hear you hardly at all. Thank you.
I'll try this now. Thanks. So essentially, these images show how you might be able to sort of read a coexisting imaginary with and this began to be the way in which we approached projects which now, brief was some kind of activity centre which might house and accommodate and assist the many varied activities which are learned in this suburban hinterland. So we began to see the sketches, going backwards and forwards, identifying particular issues. This was at centre. And these are things which normally sit below the radar of urban planning, things which don't necessarily appear in diagrams. What we're looking at here is an incredibly specific snapshots, mini programs, events, and scenarios. Things that this is pigeon novels, which have married a Hollywood sign which advertises the presence of the town to the passing highway. We're also looking at the design of a building which would house much larger events. Now, part of the brief was also about a sort of civic language and expression of this weird, fucked up, monstrous urbanism that happened accidentally. We were looking at examples of this, buildings which were incredibly communicative, incredibly symbolic. But we knew that the local vernacular and the budget would stretch to something like that. There's a sort of tension between ambition and reality. If you think it's entirely appropriate for this kind of place. In order to make the project happen, we had to develop a series of proposals, which are essentially visual stimulants that could attract partners and sponsors and political support. So images of a reality which would never exist, and models which are all very explicit. And while we were doing this, we were also testing the concepts metropolitan progression of suburban activity in Syria. Some professing we have donkey rides, Dutch R&B, the Midland Home Park Music. One followed the other. It was a kind of experiment really to see whether the idea of the program of this project has a sort of social event to bring together various disparate groups, young groups, old people, young people, so into some kind of collective expression. So after a long set of negotiations, we had a project running itself. And it turned into a park. And it's made up of a series of elements. There's a big hill, which is obviously long. There's fields, there's some islands, very large, low scale patio, a cemetery, a margarita, and a lake in the shape of a pond, scale it down a bit. So this landscape is essentially entirely and intentionally artificial. It's completely appropriate. This is just on this corner where the new man's written is the old man's written. Very large bits of rework. But it's also a collage of different landscape elements. It's not a diagram at all. It's an assemblage of narratives. Each part brings its own story. And the narratives are connected to the events and the programs that they hope to host. And they're also connected to the dream life of local as it's lived in. So the centre becomes kind of amplifying a surreal version of the town. Here we are. It's centred around this is a view, I think, from Belgium to the villa, which is the centrepiece. And the villa is essentially an industrial building, but it's been quite in something which attempts to be unique. And a slip cover of something which is both rustic and rural, but also a sort of super graphic storytelling machine. It articulates the conflicts of the context. And it's a bit like a pumpkin, it takes all the worst things and plasters all over its body in an attempt to make something which is a very strong identity. So you can see here, there's little bits of shell glorifying the signal, and this is also a reference to shell. But here we have this bucolic natural landscape also represented in a very horrible artificial ways. Polystyrene is great. Gold, plastic. It's quite sharp. This was the entrance overblown entrance into this article. It's a super simple building. There's a lobby, cafe, big hall, kitchen, upstairs there's 2 miniature cinemas. And it hosts all sorts of weird events. I think it's had lots of players there. It's been open a couple of months. And the last event they had a step position party. So in that sense, it is actually condensing this very strange local activities of something much more visible and in a sense much more exciting. So this facade tries to, in a very explicit way, tell a story. So you can see it here, talking about infrastructure, talking about nature, talking about domesticity. You can see these tree lampposts, which again are a reflection of the style of the chimneys just on the outside of the hill. So in a sense, it's trying to be very, very explicit about telling the story. We're taking these very familiar elements to this landscape and telling us something which is quite a unique expression. It's taking the stuff that's totally ordinary, it's totally every day, and telling us something that becomes a kind of new civic expression for the town of Butterfield. And in the park, there's a whole load of other bridges, view out to the hill. There's moments when the cafe opens up to the fields, when they're out big Antillean festivals in the summer. The whole thing is part of the same space. Things like hobby huts, again, this is sort of implemented model versions of the role and role of intentions. So taking a look at these weird, small programs which might exist, back room, garage, and sticking them all together is part of the sort of collage approach. This is the bridge to the children's playground, it's a frame which you fill in with what wall. Moments like this, which are domestic decoration or low art and civic scale. This is a sign telling you which way to go to the arteries. And then things like this is sort of an expression of the natural, with the log, and the illustrious, disgusting, ignorant insect. An expression of identity, so the iteration of identity is very important. This is the other part of the title, haircut, which means loveliness, which is a sort of slightly ironic term. Now, in this sense, the idea is that the project is driven by narrative rather than any kind of diagram. And it's the narrative which comes out of this reading issue, which provides us with the mechanism by which we can project forwards. So the story becomes a means of escaping from the town's pretty horrific present. It's a means of constructing the way out of the gate. So I think that's pretty much the provocation of this. Downward diagrams, upward narrative.
Okay, well, we started half an hour. We started a half hour late, so the second session wasn't supposed to start till 5:30, so we're ahead of that time frame. But it's going to, we have to make up that loss from urban collective audience. If that seems to go hand in hand with a critique or rejection of the plan, Claire's case, rejecting the plan in favor of a set of scheduling protocols and larger global infrastructure, or in Alex's case, not the plan, but the rule, or Dave's case, also not the plan, but the code maybe, and in Sam's case, not the plan, but also explicitly not the rule or the code, the story or the narrative. So in terms of these counter-plan techniques, as a way of thinking about how to elicit the participation of a collective or a new audience of architecture, they didn't have out some of the, I guess the question I would ask is the degree of resistance to the question of form or image. In other words, in Alex's case, it seemed that the rejection of the plan was partially a desire not to give the town the image of towers they didn't want. So you've given rules that didn't have a visualization attached to it as a way of getting the visualization you wanted. But if you showed them that, they would have gone for it. So like hiding the image in favor of the system to produce an image that they didn't know they wanted maybe, or didn't know they were going to have to get. But in Sam's case, maybe more explicitly. So I guess it's this question of, the question, when we put aside the plan, do we also have to put aside the issue of the image or the representation, or are there ways to recuperate necessarily an issue of the image when we come back to the great observation of the Sam set out counter examples or something of three examples.
I think one of the issues for me is how you turn urbanism into something other than a series of independent projects. So, if I were going to critique somehow set up conditions that exist that allow for rules that include architectural templates or architectural guidelines, or something that's not the same as a pattern-based formal document, the way you might get it from Seaside, but something that's also generalizable to other conditions. I'm using this word template now as a kind of strict number of choices or something like that.
Those are also the basic tools of Google design.
Speaking of the microphone.
Those are the basic techniques of Google design. When it's well done, it sets the Google master plan. So it's we're actually asking for new projects.
I just wanted to
Sorry. Here there is planners, architects, or landscape architects, which you want to do for versus people from architects and planners and landscape architects. So when you do a plan, you do a project. You do a project. I think there's a different way to approach.
The thing that comes to mind to me is the non-plan project, which was both narrative and also codes. It's a project about how to deal with Britain. It was totally imaginary. Britain was split into kind of different counties, which all have one Shakespeare County, one Bristol County. And it's all about how you introduce all sorts of programs into this landscape without ruining the image of it being which meant you have shopping malls behind hedges, for example. So the code was a way of controlling the visual field. So it was driven by a sensation and effects and the image and so on. Not as a formal resolution, that's a scenario. So in that sense, I think that's always been a very interesting example. And you can work without the kind of thing that a plan does to everybody, in every project, in every situation, which is to fix stuff and make decisions that no one ever wanted to.
Yeah, I think this is an important point, and I'm really intrigued with Dana's propositions. You want to give the city back to the architects. But that would, I mean, clearly you don't want to return, I mean, architects then shouldn't start operating like planners, right? So the challenge then is to think beyond the master plan, think beyond the kind of limits of planning. I think it was of all people, Dwight D. Eisenhower, who said plans are nothing, but planning is everything, which implies, for me, a more I'm not quite ready to go to Sam's non-planned territory, but I think there's got to be a more tactical form of planning. I think the employment studies are an interesting example there, because I agree there needs to be some kind of generalizable component, something that allows you to sort of build on the knowledge from one project to another. Also, I think it's worthwhile just in a sense being sort of attentive to place. It seems to me that project very much belongs to the American landscape, if not to the Western American landscape.
Well, so the way I've been working into that same set of issues is to say that you find these prototypical urban scapes, and I would consider quite a version of an urban scape. I don't know where I'll draw that line, and when you have a bunch of green fields that are going to become a suburban development, that doesn't any longer meet my criteria, but something in between, I don't know where it stops. But if you have a series of types of urban scapes, they present a series of types of planning, of situational planning conditions. So maybe it's something that's much more micro planning, that you would say it's not quite a code. And I think it really differs one from urban design per se, because I would say urban design is more like a set of processes. It has no formal, no strategic formal agenda inherently. It's right? Yeah, but good projects, if all we had to do was ask for good projects, we would ask for them and we would get them. But Sam's right, usually what you get is a, good architect but no budget, or bad architect and too much money, or something like that. So there's no way to guarantee good projects without some, okay, so that's the assumption, that you can't get good projects without some layer in between absolutely anything and the kinds of codes and restrictions and zoning situations we have now, even with urban design or architecture as disciplinary approaches. And I think what we're discussing is what's the bit between narrative, sort of a new generation of, basically Claire's taken on the site and made a world of it in a way, right? A new set of kind of site-specific codes for the strip that yields a new city ethos, or it's the large-scale project that affords Claire the opportunity to do what she's talking about, which I think is an interesting case, but it doesn't solve the non-linear problems that you get in existing urban conditions where there's a kind of brain that doesn't allow those big moves. So that's an interesting problem.
But I think it's actually, it is the same issue, it's just expressed at very different scales. Because there's a politics to the airport landscapes, with public funding, or do we need private investment? It's a lot of the same questions, it's just tested in a much different way. So I'd argue that the air project, given that the city is putting all of this money into it already, can we be opportunistic about how we as designers can recuperate our kind of skills in directing, or at least making aware how that money could be even made more positive for the city than the region. And I think that in some cases, those in municipal agencies need that kind of awareness brought by us, even in a really city naive way, like a project that's like too big and out of, for me, where the architect fits in is, hey, we could do this differently. And as I say, you're spending a ton of money on it anyway, you may as well do it right and think about all the possibilities.
But in your project, your diagram suggested dissolving the airport into the city, and making that exchange, not having the airport not. I'm just wondering, to what extent adding a whole series of mega program, global programs to the airport makes it more reliable as opposed to.
Well, to go back to this prototypical issue, I don't think it makes sense to separate mega scale projects that can become their own worlds from the kinds of projects that are integrated into an existing fabric, which can never have utopian goal. And that I don't know exactly how we would distinguish between those, but I think it's a big mistake to blend them together, even though I agree with Claire that architects can take over those projects also. They seem like a totally different project.
There's that phenomenon that I was talking about that's already general. It's already global. So, and I think to some extent, the minute you get into that scale, you're almost by definition, that airports obviously are one of those nodes that need to appear globally, and they can form a sort of pattern. So I think what a project is in some way quite general. And I think we could take that methodology, probably apply it to any airport across the globe.
Any airport, but that still suggests a kind of site specificity.
Or any infrastructure, no.
But, if you take a generalizability where you can get it.
It's still a close to new passage. there a difference between reconfirming an implicit narrative of a site, either extending already logic of globalization or extending the ad hocism of additional properties that have to be illegal, but really they do them already, formalized, a way to continue what happens in that community, versus the possibility of doing something not of that place at all.
Don't these three projects have in common either explicit or secret rules that are then played out, whereas a planner would play it all the way out, set of rules, and then just hand it off to somebody to figure out what the problems are. But yours, each specific set of the rules, and then even Alex plays it out, and just doesn't show anybody what it ends up to be unless they find out. So he's sort of this secret planner in the world, but he's actually an architect, and that he does play out the rules and figure out what it means. Because I think that I don't think architects invented zoning, planners invented zoning. And the architect can finance the zoning by setting up the rules and then playing it out.
But the best case would be that we write our own terms.
Yeah.
And so, because I want you marked it already, and you went to it again. I think I have a big problem with it because I do these things because I'm not hating the plan. I love the plan. I think it's the most powerful thing we have. But I think we could also take our own weakness seriously, which means that it's usually the architect is approaching the planning either, or he's approaching the city either by expressing or taking his weakness seriously by writing a book on informal urbanism. That's one strategy. Like telling everybody, look, it's not the planner's way, the city is formed, or the architect's way. Standing there, here I am Superman, the city goes like I do. And writing, showing all sorts of mostly Southern American kind of informal settlements and saying, okay, that's architecture without architects and urbanism without urbanism. But I think it's about time to even also take this planning issue serious, that you know that it's not just they who set the rules and we comply to them, but I think actually you could also embrace this whole institutionalism of the city and being a voluntary city servant as well. And just I mean it's like a war. Here are the architects and here are the planners. And I think it's time to involve and to show people also the other side. Because I think what the planning departments are doing right now is that there are lots of young people getting into these kind of businesses, and they are architects and they understand what architects want. And so I think it's a way of taking your own weakness as a potential and not just escaping to something else.
I want to say answer a question more about the movement. I have my.
Not there yet.
I know. This is my opinion. I don't think that we should be looking for a cohesive theory or I would think that this is more about a combination of very tactical intelligence and that actually basically the kind of a statement is we want to play the game, but we also want to find the rules of the game before playing it. We don't want to play a game that is defined already before us. And that's I think it's a very architectural way of thinking, because that's what we do when we design. We are good designers. We design the rules of the game and we want to play. And basically that opens up the possibility for imagination and how we can imagine the ways of inhabiting and transforming the organization of the territory to create these new ways of public engagement. And I think that that's actually talking about the power implicit in the discipline of architecture and the way we think, and how we can actually extend the way of thinking into these new realms that we have been using this back in the last 60 years because of this hyper-specialization of these different disciplines that I have to say came from architecture. We invented
one very quick remark. I think we have to avoid falling into the trap of, let's say, some of the early postmodernist critiques. I mean, it seems to me, and I think the work of both Claire and Alex is ample evidence of this. I mean, the diagrams are an aesthetic object. They're not about rationalism and calculation and kind of scientific aspiration. I mean, I think Alex is. I'm not sure if you used the word beautiful, but you said that the rules were very creative dimension for you, and certainly every aspect of your presentation was a kind of aesthetic statement in and of itself, and you know, I mean, that's. I think we can be upfront about a diagrammatic aesthetic, and you know, even admit to sort of falling in love with the character of these things.
Okay, just ask, so the people in the sideline can clear the throat, one person gets to clear the throat, and then roll and go to coffee for 5 minutes. Are there any urgencies to deal, we can spend more time at the end, but to keep us a little bit on track. Any urgent questions for Sandy and Claire?
Comment as a question. One is the comment that just this kind of organization of planners is a little bit strange. Just given that it seems that planning has been more or less impotent, at least in America, for like 20 years, probably. What is it? So,
why do you feel that?
at least in the States, at least in the United States, just situated common. The other thing would be a question about, is there a way we can kind of introduce what seems to me to be like a really big narrative, but also a kind of big diagrammatic question, which is simply the collapse of the global economy, the American housing market, et cetera, and how that affects, I think, every one of the things that we've all brought up. Large-scale infrastructural development, questions of density and our relationship with developers, even certain kinds of aesthetic decadence, et cetera, et cetera. Like, is there a way, I mean, if we're projecting ourselves into the next decade or more, like how we're going to engage the city, it seems like we can't really, in the discussion without at least introducing that to the conversation.
Well, one of the biggest projects in this country have been built in the most depressing economic times.
Right. And that's not, I'm not trying to introduce a kind of pessimism, but at least to introduce it as a.
No, I agree. But on one hand, some of the projects are still suffering from kind of capitalist investment. But on the other hand, when you think of, President-elect's recent statement of a huge investment, perhaps in public works projects again, and you look at buildings like the Merchandise Mart in Chicago, which was a WPA project in 1932, that there's optimism even in the economic downturn for the discipline and for health.
But it's also a rule I was researching is that the tallest buildings are always built at the end of a boom cycle.
So we're going short.
Yes.
No, I think the other thing that's interesting about that, playing off the infrastructure question, we were talking about this a little bit yesterday, is that if you think planners are impotent, maybe you'd say in this particular era, it would be the engineers that are all omnipotent. If my concern would be that in this next sort of generation of projects, if there are such things like infrastructure that builds back to work and builds up the economy, it will go to the engineers because we've seen more superfluous than they have. And I actually don't think planners are impotent. I think that we get blamed for their problems. So I still want to kill them. But I mean, I was putting that forward as a provocation, obviously. But I do think that the case is that when people are all mad at traffic and we put in a new building, they say, I didn't want that job, right? And so Alex has to go through his Herculean efforts in order to get density, because density looks like an architectural problem. parking does happen, and because when you talk about the codes, you're talking about it as an outsider, house. So then we would have to come fortify ourselves as outsiders and eliminate the insiders.
We're gonna, for the sake of the panel anyway, take a 5-minute break, coffee, bathroom.